Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you ask your questions on faith and life, and I do my best to give a biblical perspective. Well, we are going to jump into today's question that has arisen out of the message today in our live services. Unfortunately, we had technical difficulties, and so the online version is not there, and it won't be up later either. It was just something went wrong. So if you didn't catch the sermon today, then essentially what we were talking about was the role of Israel in the economy of God, in order to help us get a perspective on what's happening in the Middle East, in order to pray more effectively, rather than to take a political or a humanistic view to what was happening, so that we could have some grasp of the plans and purposes of God for Israel and the bigger picture, so that we were able to be a little bit more engaged, a little bit more aware than perhaps we may otherwise be. And the question comes out of that. The question is, can you say more on why you believe that replacement theology isn't biblical? Today was the first I've heard that the church hasn't replaced Israel. I'm happy to talk about it. Let me just say, this was not the thrust of the sermon, really. This was not about what's wrong with replacement theology or anything like that. It was just something that I spoke about as part of the message. Right up front, let me just say that I can't do justice to your question in the context of Q&A. There's far too many scriptures, and it will take too much time to really unpack them all. But let me just answer you like this. I can understand why perhaps you've never heard of it before. I don't think many Christians have given it a lot of thought. Equally, some have. It's the default position of many Christians. This idea that the church has somehow the spiritual Israel through Christ, and therefore the prophecies and the promises made to Israel have now belong to the church, and that Israel is, when we talk about Israel, we're no longer talking about a literal Israel in the way that we did in regards to the promises of God. It's a figurative thing that's to be totally separated out from the nation of Israel as a state today. Let me just say that there are many different versions, or a number of different versions of replacement theology, but I think they're all based on the same premise, and that is essentially that God used Israel to prepare the way for the Messiah. But now that that's happened, the church is the expression of God's election, of God's or His chosen people, because Israel rejected the offer of salvation through Christ. Now, I get that it's a bit more nuanced than that, but essentially that's what replacement theology is about, that we had the first covenant, and then because they rejected Christ, that God transferred all those prophecies, all those promises to the church. And I just talked about why I struggle with that. Your question is, why do I think that's not biblical? Well, let me just give you a very, very brief idea of where I come from biblically, and I encourage you to Google and to have a look for yourself, and you're going to find a myriad of ways, but ultimately you've got to come to a position yourself. You'll find a myriad of positions, not ways, that explain either pro or against or whatever, and you've got to come to a reasoned position yourself of what the scriptures say and don't say. A good place to start is Romans chapters 9 through 11, where Paul wrestles with this whole idea of Israel and the economy of God, and what Israel means to God, and how we are to relate to Israel as the church, as the body of Christ. And let me bring it up here. In Romans chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, Paul says, "Did God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery? Of course not. They were disobedient, so God made salvation available to the Gentiles, but He wanted His own people to become jealous and claim it for themselves. Now, if the Gentiles were enriched because the people of Israel turned down God's offer of salvation, think how much greater a blessing the world will share when they finally accept it." So what Paul's saying is, have they fallen beyond recovery? Has God taken what was theirs and given it to the church? And he says, no. That's not so. He's saying that God hasn't taken what was Israel's and then given it to us. What he's saying is that we are included in the promise to Israel. Not that we have replaced Israel, but that we are included in the promises to Israel. And that's why he goes on and he talks about how Gentile Christians have been grafted into Israel, so that the blessings that God gave to Abraham now flow to us as well. And I like that analogy of being grafted in. It's a picture of grafting a branch into a tree, and the sap that gives life to the branch isn't contained in the branch, but it flows from the tree. The trunk is still alive. It's not replaced. It gives life to that which has been grafted in. And if you read chapters 9 through 11, you're going to see how Paul understands this relationship in profound ways. And the reason I start there is that I think it makes a lot more sense of what we read concerning the promises that God made to Israel in the first covenant that we read about in the Old Testament. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 7, we read, "For you are a holy people who belong to the Lord your God. Of all the people on earth, the Lord your God has chosen you to be his own special treasure." So they are God's chosen people. And we read in Genesis 12 how all the nations of the world will be blessed through Israel. That's that picture of the tree and the branches being grafted in, not like the tree's been left to its own devices, cut down, whatever, and a new one planted. We've been grafted in to that which is God's own special treasure. And in Genesis and elsewhere, we read how that covenant that God made is an everlasting covenant. So it's not like it's come to an end and now God's done a new thing with the church, and therefore all of the blessings that were Israel's are now ours, and Israel's been cut out. In Genesis 17, verses 7, yes, it is. "I'll confirm my covenant with you and your descendants after you from generation to generation. This is the everlasting covenant. I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you." So notice two things. He says that it's an everlasting covenant. It doesn't come to an end. That's why Paul understands us being grafted into that. But also he's saying, "I will always be your God. And the God of your descendants after you." So it says that God still has this special relationship with Israel. And it's not just a spiritual thing in the way that some people would see it today. Israel still holds a particular relationship with God. And you can't spiritualize away the promises that were made and saying we replace Israel, therefore you can't talk about the land as a literal inheritance and all that sort of thing. I just don't think you can justify that, because in 1 Chronicles 16, 17, no, it's 1 Chronicles 16, verse 17, we read how the promise of the land is everlasting and not just to be thought of figuratively. It says, let me bring it up. "He confirmed it to Jacob as a decree and to the people of Israel as a never-ending covenant. I will give you the land of Canaan as your special possession." So right there we see how God's called himself a people, and he will always be their God, and he's given them land, and it's everlasting covenant. And that means that whatever the relationship between Israel and the church is, the church has not replaced Israel, because otherwise we've cut off from the life that blessing to Abraham supplies to us. Now, I know that in Romans he talks about what it means to be a true Jew, not just to be circumcised of the flesh, but circumcised of the heart. And people have seen that as a picture to true Israel, what we would call born-again believers. But that's not what Paul's talking about. Again, I wish I had time to unpack that. But if you read through chapters 9 to 11, you'll see that's not what Paul is saying at all. And so that's why I don't believe that replacement theology is biblical. There's so many problems inherent in it. I mean, we see in the Old Testament that everlasting and never-ending is the way that God describes the covenant. And so, clearly for replacement theologians, never-ending doesn't mean never-ending, and everlasting doesn't mean everlasting. Likewise, land doesn't mean land. They have to make it mean something else. And I just think that, if you're going to do that, what else are you going to do with Scripture to make it say what you want it to say? So, yeah, I encourage you just to do some research online and have a look at various positions. You have to come to your own biblically informed position. But I'm convinced that the Scriptures point us in the direction that we have been grafted in, and God still has a particular plan and purpose for Israel that is yet to be fully realized, that we should pray and uphold it, that we should nurture and support Israel. It doesn't mean to say politically, but theologically, biblically, and see it try and see it from God's perspective. Because our future is connected to that in very real and significant eternal ways. So in a nutshell, that's why I don't subscribe to replacement theology. There are a lot of people who have been accused of replacement theology, a lot of positions. I think it's uncharitable. I just think it's they've been misrepresented, but it is a growing trend in the church today, and that's why I raised it. So hey, love to hear your thoughts on it. But that's all I'm going to say today. Hey, if you've got questions on faith and life, jump over to slido.com, use the hashtag askhamish. I'd love to hear from you. But till next time, God bless.